the frozen sailor. In 1984, a research team exploring a remote Arctic island made a discovery that contradicted everything taught about human survival limits. They found the perfectly preserved body of a sailor from an 1845 expedition, frozen for 139 years. When they examined him, they discovered something that shouldn't have been possible. His internal organs were perfectly intact, his facial features recognizable, and tissue samples showed he'd been alive far longer after his ship was abandoned than anyone thought humans could survive in those conditions. The expedition he'd been part of was famous. 2 ships with 129 men that had vanished searching for the Northwest Passage. For over a century, historians taught that the crews had died quickly, probably within months of abandoning their ice-trapped ships. The extreme Arctic conditions, they said, would have killed them rapidly. Survival textbooks use the expedition as an example of how quickly humans perish in extreme cold without proper supplies. The frozen sailor proved this wrong. His body showed he'd survived for years, not months. The condition of his remains, his clothing, and items found nearby indicated he'd been alive far longer than experts claimed was possible. His stomach contents showed he'd been eating, surviving somehow in conditions that textbooks said would kill a human in weeks. Even more disturbing were the physical findings. Tissue analysis revealed high levels of lead, suggesting the expedition's canned food had been poisoning them. But it also showed evidence of scurvy, starvation, and something else, signs that the men had resorted to cannibalism to survive longer than anyone thought possible. When the findings were published, Arctic survival experts initially rejected them. The timeline didn't match what they taught about human survival limits. The evidence must be misinterpreted, they claimed, but as more bodies were found and examined over the following years, the pattern repeated. These men had survived far longer than textbooks said was possible, enduring conditions that supposedly would have killed them quickly. The discovery forced complete revision of what's taught about human survival, limits, and extreme conditions. The textbooks were wrong. Humans could survive far longer in impossible conditions than experts had claimed. The frozen sailor's body was proof that sometimes the human will to survive exceeds what science says is possible. The living fossil. In 1938, a museum curator in South Africa received a strange fish from a local trawler. She didn't recognize the species and sent sketches to a fish expert. His response was shock. She'd found a coelacanth, a fish that had been extinct for 66 million years. Every textbook, every paleontology course, every expert taught that coelacanths had died out with the dinosaurs. The discovery of a living specimen contradicted everything taught about extinction and what fossils actually tell us. The coelacanth wasn't just any fish, it was considered a crucial link in evolutionary history. Textbooks featured its fossilized remains as evidence of how fish had evolved to eventually walk on land. Students were taught that this ancient fish represented a stage in evolution that had ended millions of years ago. The fossil record clearly showed coelacanths had gone extinct in the Cretaceous period. This was established fact, taught in every biology and paleontology program. When the curator's fish was identified as a living coelacanth, the scientific community was thrown into crisis. Everything they'd taught students about extinction events, about the reliability of the fossil record, about how we interpret ancient life, all of it was suddenly questionable. If coelacanths had survived 66 million years without leaving fossil evidence, what else had survived that we thought was extinct? How reliable were extinction timelines if a fish could hide from science for millions of years? The fossil record, presented to students as a complete picture of life's history, was revealed to have massive gaps. The discovery got worse for established teachings. When scientists studied the living coelacanth, they found it hadn't evolved significantly from its fossil ancestors. For 66 million years, a time span that saw dinosaurs disappear and mammals rise to dominance, the coelacanth had remained essentially unchanged. This contradicted teachings about evolution, requiring constant change and adaptation. Experts scrambled to explain how they had been so wrong. They had taught with absolute certainty that coelacanths were extinct. They'd used the extinction as a key example in courses and textbooks. Students had memorized it as fact, and it was completely wrong. The coelacanth discovery led to a new term, Lazarus taxa, species that seem to go extinct in the fossil record but later reappear alive. Since 1938, numerous other living fossils have been discovered, each one contradicting what had been taught about extinction and evolution. The coelacanth proved that much of what we are taught as definitive fact is actually educated guessing based on incomplete evidence. The impossible footprints. In 1976, a paleontologist discovered human-like footprints in volcanic ash in Tanzania, dated to 3.6 million years ago. This contradicted everything taught about human evolution. According to every textbook and anthropology course, human ancestors 3.6 million years ago couldn't walk upright like modern humans. They were still primarily tree-dwelling, with feet adapted for climbing. The footprints proved otherwise. They showed a fully modern walking gait with modern foot structure, millions of years before humans were supposed to have developed these features. The discovery site contained multiple footprint trails. When researchers analyzed them, they found footprints virtually indistinguishable from those of modern humans walking on a beach. The heel strike, the arch, the push-off from the toe, everything matched modern human walking biomechanics. This shouldn't have been possible. Every anthropology student was taught that human ancestors from this period, Australopithecus afarensis, were transitional creatures. They were supposed to have ape-like feet still adapted for climbing, with divergent big toes like chimpanzees. They were supposed to walk awkwardly, not fully upright. The evolutionary timeline taught that fully modern walking didn't develop until much later in human evolution. The footprints contradicted all of this. The individuals who made these tracks walked exactly like modern humans. Their feet were modern in structure. They weren't transitional. They were fully developed for bipedal walking, millions of years too early, according to what was taught in classrooms. When the discovery was published, many anthropologists resisted the implications. They proposed alternative explanations. Maybe the tracks weren't as old as claimed. Maybe they weren't actually from human ancestors. Maybe the analysis was flawed. The resistance was fierce because accepting the footprints meant admitting that fundamental teachings about human evolution were wrong. But the evidence was undeniable. The volcanic ash could be reliably dated. The footprints were clearly from bipedal creatures with modern foot anatomy, and they were 3.6 million years old, far older than the timeline for modern walking that was taught in every university. The discovery forced revision of human evolution teachings. The neat, linear progression from ape-like ancestor to modern human, the timeline taught to generations of students, was revealed to be oversimplified at best, wrong at worst. Human ancestors had developed modern walking far earlier than experts claimed. Perhaps most troubling was what the footprints revealed about how evolutionary facts are taught. Students learned definitive timelines, when specific features evolved, what ancient humans could and couldn't do. These weren't presented as theories or best guesses, but as established facts. The footprints proved that much of what was taught with certainty was actually speculation based on limited fossil evidence. The survivor species. In 1994, a park ranger in Australia discovered a grove of trees in a remote canyon that shouldn't exist. The species, Wollemi pine, was known only from fossils. Every botany textbook taught that this tree had gone extinct 2 million years ago. The discovery of a living population of fewer than 100 adult trees contradicted everything taught about plant extinction and how we identify extinct species from the fossil record. The Wollemi pine wasn't an obscure species. It was distinctive and well documented in the fossil record. Students studied its fossilized remains in paleobotany courses. Its extinction 2 million years ago was cited as an example of how climate change eliminated species. The fossil evidence was clear. These trees had vanished from the earth long before humans existed. When the ranger found living specimens in a hidden canyon, botanical experts initially thought there must be a mistake. Perhaps these were similar but different trees. DNA analysis would prove they were modern relatives of the fossil species, not the actual extinct tree itself. The DNA analysis proved them wrong. The living trees were genetically identical to the fossils. They weren't relatives or similar species. They were the exact same tree that was supposed to have gone extinct 2 million years ago. For 2 million years, while textbooks declared them extinct, these trees had been quietly surviving in one hidden location. The discovery shattered confidence in extinction declarations. How many other species declared extinct were actually surviving in remote locations? How reliable were the textbooks that stated with certainty which species were gone forever? The Wollemi pine proved that extinct often meant we haven't found any, rather than they don't exist. What made this particularly embarrassing for science education was that the canyon where the trees survived wasn't that remote. It was in a national park in Australia, not some unexplored jungle or remote island. The trees had been there all along, surviving through 2 million years of climate change that supposedly killed them, and no one had noticed. Botany courses had to be revised. The confident declarations about extinction timelines and patterns had to be softened. Students who'd memorized that Wollemi pines went extinct 2 million years ago had been taught fiction as fact. The discovery revealed how much of what's taught as established knowledge is actually assumption based on absence of evidence. The underwater city. In 2000, marine archaeologists exploring waters off the coast of India discovered massive stone structures in 120 feet of water. The structures showed signs of deliberate construction: walls, buildings, streets. Carbon dating of artifacts found at the site dated them to 9,500 years ago. This contradicted everything taught about human civilization. According to every history textbook and archaeology course, advanced civilization didn't exist 9,500 years ago. Humans were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers, not building cities with stone architecture. The discovery site covered several square miles of ocean floor. The structures weren't natural formations. They showed right angles, regular patterns, and features consistent with human construction. Massive stone blocks appeared to be foundation walls. Regular spacing suggested planned architecture. The arrangement looked like a city that had been submerged. This shouldn't exist according to established history. Students were taught that the first advanced civilizations, with cities, architecture, and organized societies, emerged around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The idea that sophisticated civilization existed 9,500 years ago contradicted the entire timeline of human development taught in schools. When the discovery was announced, many archaeologists dismissed it immediately. The structures must be natural, they claimed, despite the regular patterns and right angles. The dating must be wrong. Any explanation was preferable to admitting that civilization might be thousands of years older than what was taught in textbooks. But independent analysis confirmed the findings. The structures showed evidence of tool marks and deliberate shaping. The carbon dating was accurate. The site was a genuine underwater archaeological site that predated the supposed beginning of civilization by thousands of years. The implications were staggering. If a city existed 9,500 years ago, it would have been built during the Ice Age, when sea levels were much lower. The city's current underwater location suggested it had been coastal and was submerged when glaciers melted and sea levels rose. This meant organized human civilization existed during a period when textbooks taught humans were still living in small nomadic groups. The discovery forced uncomfortable questions about what else might be hidden underwater. If one ancient city was submerged by rising sea levels, how many others were? Could there be entire civilizations from before the official beginning of civilization, now lying under hundreds of feet of water where archaeologists never look? History textbooks still largely ignore the discovery, continuing to teach that civilization began around 5,000 years ago. But the underwater structures contradict this teaching. They prove that our understanding of human history's timeline is incomplete at best, completely wrong at worst. The surgical skulls. In 2013, archaeologists excavating a 3,000-year-old burial site in Peru discovered something that contradicted everything taught about ancient medicine. Multiple skulls showed clear evidence of trepanation, surgical holes drilled into the skull, with bone regrowth indicating the patient survived the surgery. What shocked medical historians was the survival rate. Over 80% of patients survived, which is higher than the survival rate for similar procedures in Civil War-era American medicine, 2,800 years later. Medical history courses taught that ancient medicine was primitive, a combination of superstition, luck, and procedures that usually killed patients. Students learned that effective surgery requiring knowledge of anatomy, infection control, and surgical technique didn't develop until relatively modern times. Ancient procedures were supposed to be crude and usually fatal. The Peruvian skulls contradicted this completely. The surgical holes were precisely made, showing knowledge of safe areas to penetrate the skull. The procedures had been performed with tools that created clean cuts with minimal bone damage. Multiple skulls showed evidence of repeated surgeries, patients surviving one procedure and returning for another years later. Most remarkably, the bone regrowth patterns indicated low infection rates. Somehow, 3,000 years ago, these surgeons were preventing infection at rates that American Civil War surgeons, 2,800 years later, couldn't match. Civil War surgeons lost about 50% of their skull surgery patients to infection. The ancient Peruvian surgeons had an 80% survival rate. When medical historians analyzed the findings, they couldn't explain it. Ancient people weren't supposed to understand infection prevention. Germ theory wasn't developed until the 1860s. Yet somehow these ancient surgeons were achieving infection prevention results that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. The discovery forced complete revision of what's taught about ancient medicine. The narrative of steady progress from primitive ancient medicine to modern sophisticated medicine was revealed to be false. In some ways, ancient surgeons were more successful than their counterparts thousands of years later. Research into the procedures revealed ancient Peruvian surgeons had developed sophisticated techniques. They understood which areas of the skull could be safely penetrated. They had effective methods for controlling bleeding. They used substances with natural antibiotic properties. Their surgical knowledge was genuine medical science, not primitive superstition. The skulls proved that much of what's taught about ancient people being less intelligent or capable than modern humans is prejudice rather than fact. These ancient surgeons had figured out through observation and experimentation what worked, developing surgical protocols that modern medicine didn't match for thousands of years. The child genius builders. In 2007, archaeologists excavating an ancient site in Turkey discovered something that contradicted fundamental teachings about human civilization's development. The site, Göbekli Tepe, contained massive stone temples with sophisticated carved pillars, some weighing 20 tons. Radiocarbon dating revealed the site was 11,500 years old. This contradicted everything taught about human development. According to every textbook, humans 11,500 years ago were primitive hunter-gatherers who couldn't organize, couldn't work stone, and couldn't build monuments. The site proved otherwise. The temples weren't simple structures. They featured massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, with detailed carvings of animals covering the surfaces. The construction required quarrying, transporting, and precisely positioning stones weighing many tons. The carving showed artistic sophistication and symbolic thinking. This was advanced organized human activity. According to what was taught in every anthropology and archaeology course, this couldn't exist. Humans 11,500 years ago, before the development of agriculture, before permanent settlements, before what was taught as the beginning of civilization, shouldn't have been capable of organizing the labor, developing the techniques, or maintaining the social structure necessary to build such a site. The teaching was that civilization developed in a specific sequence: first agriculture, then permanent settlements, then specialization of labor, then organized construction projects. Göbekli Tepe reversed this sequence. The builders were hunter-gatherers with no evidence of agriculture, yet they had organized to build sophisticated temples before they'd even developed farming. When the site was dated and its implications became clear, many archaeologists resisted. The dating must be wrong, they claimed. Or perhaps the site wasn't as sophisticated as it appeared. Or maybe it was built later, and the dating was contaminated by older materials. The resistance reflected how deeply invested academic teaching was in the established timeline of human development. But the evidence was undeniable. The dating was accurate. The construction was genuinely sophisticated. And it predated the beginning of civilization by thousands of years. Everything taught about how and when human civilization developed was wrong. The discovery raised profound questions. If hunter-gatherers could organize to build sophisticated temples 11,500 years ago, what else were they capable of? How much has been underestimated about prehistoric human capabilities? The site suggested that the standard teaching, portraying prehistoric humans as barely more capable than animals until agriculture suddenly civilized them, was fundamentally false. Göbekli Tepe also contradicted teachings about why civilization developed. Textbooks taught that agriculture came first, creating surplus food that allowed specialization and monument building. The site proved the reverse. Organized monument building came first, and agriculture developed later, possibly to support the workers building these temples. The impossible navigation. In 1992, researchers analyzing ancient maps discovered something that contradicted everything taught about early navigation capabilities. Several medieval maps showed Antarctica, a continent that wouldn't be discovered until 1820. Even more impossibly, the maps showed Antarctica's coastline as it appears under the ice, featuring bays and inlets currently buried under mile-thick glaciers. This contradicted teachings that accurate global mapping didn't exist until modern times and suggested someone had mapped Antarctica when it was ice-free, over 6,000 years ago. The maps weren't crude sketches. They showed remarkable accuracy in latitudes and relative positions of continents. When researchers compared one medieval map's depiction of Antarctica's coastline to modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar, they matched. The map showed coastal features buried under thousands of feet of ice that weren't discovered until seismic surveys in the 1950s. According to everything taught in history and geography courses, this was impossible. Medieval mapmakers supposedly had limited geographic knowledge, relying on fragmented information and speculation. The idea that they could accurately map a continent that wouldn't be discovered for 400 years contradicted all teaching about medieval knowledge and capabilities. Even more problematic, the map's accuracy suggested they were copied from much older sources. If the maps showed ice-free Antarctica, the source maps would have been created during the Ice Age, before glaciers covered the continent, over 6,000 years ago. This would mean sophisticated maritime exploration and cartographic surveying existed 6,000 years before what textbooks taught as the beginning of civilization. When researchers published their findings, geographers and historians largely dismissed them. The maps couldn't show what they appeared to show, they claimed. The resemblance to Antarctica must be coincidental. The accuracy must be exaggerated. Any explanation was preferable to admitting that sophisticated global mapping might have existed thousands of years earlier than taught. But cartographic analysis confirmed the accuracy. The maps used mathematical projection techniques supposedly not developed until much later. The coastline details matched modern surveys with precision that couldn't be coincidental. The evidence suggested the medieval mapmakers had copied from much older source maps, maps created by a civilization with advanced navigation and surveying capabilities. The discovery contradicted fundamental teachings about human technological development. Students are taught that sophisticated navigation, accurate cartography, and global exploration are relatively modern achievements. The maps suggested that these capabilities existed in the ancient past and were lost, only to be rediscovered thousands of years later. The advanced batteries. In 1936, archaeologists discovered clay jars in Iraq dating to 200 BCE that contradicted everything taught about ancient technology. Inside the jars were copper cylinders, iron rods, and evidence of acidic liquid. When examined, researchers realized they were looking at functional electrical batteries, created 1,800 years before electricity was discovered. This contradicted teachings that electrical theory and application were modern developments emerging in the 18th and 19th centuries. When a researcher built a working replica using the same materials and design, filling it with vinegar as the electrolyte, it produced electrical current, approximately 1.1 to 2 volts. The ancient jar wasn't coincidentally battery-like. It was a functional electrical device. According to every physics and history course, this shouldn't exist. Students are taught that electricity was discovered by European scientists in the 1700s, with practical applications developing in the 1800s. The narrative is clear. Ancient peoples had no knowledge of electricity, no ability to generate or use electrical current. Electrical theory and technology were supposed to be modern achievements. The ancient batteries contradicted this teaching completely. Someone 2,000 years ago understood that combining certain metals with acidic liquid generated electrical current. They'd designed devices to produce this effect. They were creating and presumably using electricity 18 centuries before Benjamin Franklin and his contemporaries supposedly discovered it. When the findings were published, many historians and physicists rejected the interpretation. The jars must have had some other purpose, they claimed. The battery-like design must be coincidental. Any explanation was preferable to admitting that electrical technology existed 2,000 years earlier than taught in every textbook. But the evidence was undeniable. Multiple similar jars had been found, all following the same design. The configuration wasn't accidental. It was intentional construction of electrical devices. The question wasn't whether they were batteries, but what ancient people were using them for. Physical evidence from the same period suggested one use: electroplating. Metal artifacts showed evidence of electrical plating techniques, which require electrical current. Ancient texts from the region described divine lights that burned without flame in temple sanctuaries, possibly electrical lights powered by battery arrays. The ancient batteries proved that the teaching of steady technological progress from primitive ancient times to sophisticated modern era is false. Advanced knowledge existed in the ancient world, was lost, and had to be rediscovered much later. Entire technologies vanished from human knowledge for centuries before being invented again. The prehistoric machine. In 1900, divers recovered a corroded bronze mechanism from an ancient shipwreck off Greece. For decades, it sat dismissed as a simple device. Then X-ray analysis revealed the truth. Inside was a complex system of over 30 interlocking gears, performing astronomical calculations that contradicted everything taught about ancient technology. According to textbooks, mechanical devices of this sophistication didn't exist until Renaissance Europe, 1,500 years later. The mechanism proved ancient Greeks had mechanical computing technology that was then completely lost and not rediscovered for over a millennium. The device, later called the Antikythera mechanism, wasn't simple. It contained dozens of precisely cut gears with teeth so fine they were barely visible. The gears worked together to calculate positions of the sun, moon, and planets, predict eclipses, and track the Olympic Games cycle. It was an astronomical calculator. Users turned a crank, and the gears computed celestial positions for any given date. Engineering courses taught that gear systems of this complexity emerged during the Renaissance. Ancient people supposedly lacked the theoretical knowledge and manufacturing capability to create precision gear trains. The mechanical clock, humanity's first complex geared device, was taught as a medieval invention. The idea that ancient Greeks had created something more sophisticated 1,000 years earlier contradicted established teaching about technological development. When researchers finally understood what the mechanism did, they were shocked. The gear ratios precisely represented astronomical cycles known to ancient Greek astronomers. The device encoded sophisticated mathematical understanding of celestial mechanics. It required both theoretical astronomical knowledge and advanced mechanical engineering and manufacturing skills. Modern attempts to reconstruct the mechanism using only tools available to ancient Greeks have struggled. Creating gears with the necessary precision is extremely difficult without modern machine tools. Yet somehow, ancient craftsmen had done it. The mechanism proved that teachings about ancient limitations were wrong. Ancient Greeks possessed both the theoretical knowledge and practical manufacturing capability to create sophisticated mechanical computers. This technology then vanished completely, lost so thoroughly that when Renaissance Europeans developed mechanical clocks, they had no knowledge that similar devices had existed 1,500 years earlier. The discovery revealed something disturbing about how history is taught. Students learn a narrative of steady progress. Ancient people primitive, medieval people somewhat advanced, modern people sophisticated. The Antikythera mechanism proved this narrative is false. Ancient civilization possessed technologies that were then lost for over a millennium. Human technological capability isn't a straight line of progress, but a series of peaks and valleys, with entire technologies vanishing and having to be rediscovered. Perhaps most troubling is what the mechanism suggests about lost knowledge. This device survived only by accident. It was on a ship that sank, preserving it in seawater that corroded it but didn't destroy it. How many other sophisticated devices were simply melted down for their metal over the centuries? How much ancient technological knowledge was lost completely because the objects that embodied it were recycled or destroyed? These 10 discovered cases share a common impact. They contradicted everything we'd been taught. Each discovery forced experts to admit that what they'd been confidently teaching for years was wrong. The pattern is clear. What we're taught as established fact is often incomplete understanding based on limited evidence. Experts make assumptions about what ancient people could or couldn't do, what's possible or impossible, and present these assumptions as fact. When discoveries contradict these assumptions, the initial response is often denial rather than acceptance. What makes these cases particularly significant is what they reveal about education. Students memorize facts from textbooks: when civilization began, when electricity was discovered, how ancient medicine worked. These aren't presented as current theories or best guesses, but as definitive knowledge. The discoveries prove that much of what's taught with certainty is actually speculation. These cases also reveal systematic bias in how history and human capability are taught. There's a pervasive assumption that ancient people were less intelligent, less capable, less sophisticated than modern humans. The discoveries repeatedly prove this wrong. Ancient people were just as intelligent and capable. They simply had different knowledge and tools. Perhaps most important is what these cases suggest about current teaching. If so many established facts have been contradicted by discoveries, how many current teachings are wrong? What are students learning today as fact that future discoveries will prove false? The discovered cases that contradicted everything taught remind us to question what we're told, to remember that established knowledge often reflects the limits of current evidence rather than actual truth, and to consider that maybe the ancients knew more than we give them credit for.